My name is Brian J. Francis, and this is my story. I was born and raised in First Nation community. We were the first indigenous group to be nominated for a Juno Award. If we lose our language, our culture, where do we go? We just can't give up. We have to keep fighting. We have to keep struggling for us to be recognized as who we are, as Mi'kmaq people.
Hello everyone, it is such a pleasure to be with you today in order to release this first episode of Tell Me Your Story, podcast on native and indigenous people from all around the world, where we discuss community, culture and spirituality. A place to share, listen and understand what we don't know about the other. Welcome in the discovery of a new story. And for this first English podcast, I have the great honor, I would say, to have with me today Brian G. Francis. So Brian, you belong to the Mik'maq nation in Canada and you live in New Brunswick. You've done so many things. It's going to be difficult to summarize, I would say, but you are a filmmaker, a poet, painter, and also a music producer. But maybe more importantly, you always had a great role in survival of your language and native culture. And that's obviously something we will speak about in details in this podcast. But first of all, welcome, Brian, and thank you so much for accepting this invitation and for being with us today. Just in order for our audience to know you a bit better, I was wondering, could you just introduce yourself in your own language, maybe, and then doing the translation in English, if you can?
Well, adiyo, dali tayo ng Ilagisko. In Brian Francis, dali di Igamawaj, Elsipogtog Klewi. Isa Imopsit Amaru, Walalio, Danelli, Miwadamo, Danage, Deloti Mik'maq, Yamon, what you said we know, Jack and Dandelody. My name is Brian Francis. I'm from the Mi'kmaq Nation in Brunswick, Canada. My community is Elsipogtog, and I'm very honored to be a guest in this podcast today. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Brian. It's not, I have to say, it's not often that we can hear the language of native nations. And I'm sure, most of the audience never heard a word of the Mik'maq language. So thank you for that. The big question we can start with in this podcast is related to, obviously, your story. Could you just maybe, describe yourself, describe what has been your life so far, you growing up in your community in Canada, in New Brunswick? What was the life when you were like a child, just to know your life a bit better?
Well, I was born and raised in First Nation community. It was called Big Cove back then. Now it's called Elsipogtog. It's sort of a return back to the original place name of our people. I'm a Mi'kmaq person. I speak Mi'kmaq is my first language. Growing up, we were basically living within the boundaries of the First Nation community. Back then, they were called reserves. Our population was about 2,200. Right now, we're at, I think we're about 3,500 living on reserve. So basically, that's the world we lived in until we went to school there until grade 6. And then we were bused to a neighboring community, non-native community called Elsipogtog. And that was sort of like our first introduction to another world out there. So I never pursued formal education after that. I basically decided to start my own business. So I've been basically an entrepreneur since when I got out of high school. Still haven't made any money yet. I still tried. Then later on, I went to work in Ottawa, which is really the first time I left the community. And then I returned home and I pursued my music business sort of in another level. I managed an international recording group called Eagle Feather, which was from my community. We actually did tours across Canada, a couple of tours down in the eastern United States, and did some performances out like in Europe. We were the first indigenous group to be nominated for a Juno Award, which is in Canada is pretty similar to like the Grammy Awards in the United States. So we kind of made history back then. We didn't know what we were accomplishing or whatever. We just did what we were doing. And but for a small group of Native musicians to to reach the pinnacle of Canadian music success. I think that's pretty impressive, I guess. It was around that time too that the Aboriginal People's Television Network was coming on online, and it was sort of a natural progression for me to go from music to television production, and it was a way for me to tell my stories, I guess. And
So just to understand, when you say telling your story, so why did you feel there was this need for people to know about your story and maybe more generally about the Mik'maq?
I always, in my travels, I always heard about people indicating how they would like to interact and meet and come to our community, but there was apprehension. They didn't know how to go about visiting our communities, or if they were even allowed. So when I first developed my documentary series, I said, well, instead of bringing people here, why don't I bring our community to them and tell stories about our people and our elders, our spiritual leaders, our musicians, our artists, sort of like an anthology series on a day in the life of a Mi'kmaq person, sort of thing. I've had 2 series on that Aboriginal People's Television Network. Just recently, I was the first Mi'kmaq interpreter at the House of Commons in Canada, so it was quite an honor. And last year, I received the Lieutenant Governor's Award here in New Brunswick for my work in languages. So that basically is my life in a nutshell, I guess.
What a life, as you say. I did find it very interesting, and that's why I really wanted to have you as a guest for this podcast, as I really felt that most of your work were basically led by the will to share your culture to others. And so talking about your nation, the Mik'maq nation, and your culture, most of the audience never heard about it before. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about its history and also what led to the situation where your people and your community are now.
It's interesting because most people don't realize that the Mi'kmaq people, being on the east coast of Canada, the easternmost coast of Canada, were the first people to have contact with Europeans when they first arrived. There was early contact with Vikings and what have you, but I guess the first formal and official contact was in 1604 with the French. It was a good relationship. It was, I think, the French came here not looking to take the land or conquer anybody or anything. They were here for fish and furs, basically, and the Mi'kmaq had fish and furs, and a really good relationship developed between the French and the Mi'kmaq people around that time, up until the 1700s, when the British came, and there was disputes between the French and the British, and the French were our first allies, and that relationship, although strained a little bit now, has always basically been maintained, and it's always been a fairly strong relationship, even to this day. So having said that, we have basically lost the most as far as indigenous people are concerned in North America. We have lost our ceremonies, our prayers, our songs, our dances, with the imposition, I guess, of Christianity to our people. A lot of our ways were basically banned and forbidden. We really lost, I would say, the majority of our ways, of our culture, of our ceremonies, of who we were prior to the arrival of the new man. I think we're on the brink of extinction. So growing up in the 1900s, I guess, our people suffered a lot since the 1700s to current day, actually. We were probably the poorest of the poor. Our communities were, there's a lot of our communities that are in third world conditions, actually, with no clean drinking water and poor housing, chronic alcohol and drug abuse. But see, these are all symptoms of a history of what transpired from the signing of treaties starting in 1725, I believe, where there was promises made that in exchange for land and resources, that the governments would basically take care of our people, and we would become wealthy landowners, basically, and there would be a royalty paid to our people. That didn't happen.
Why do you think they did that? What was the purpose for doing this and for trying to cut you from your own culture and your own tradition, your own ways? So why do you think they did that?
Basically, the ideology or the mentality was that in maybe 100 years that the Mi'kmaq people would not exist, and then we would not owe them anything, sort of thing. We're still here. We still have a language that's been spoken for thousands of years. There's archaeological evidence that the Mi'kmaq have been here for over 10,000 years. And to be able to speak a language that's that old is really amazing. But we're on the verge of losing that as well. So as a young man growing up in our community, we were immersed in the Roman Catholic religion. That's the only form of religion or spirituality that we were exposed to.
But do you mean there was like no way to learn, your ceremonies, or what was the situation, for you directly in your community?
I personally only became aware of our traditional ceremonies probably when I was about 25 years old, when I attended my first powwow, I'm going to call it, and it was just mind blowing that I didn't know any of this of our people. And a lot of the ways that we're practicing now are really borrowed from out west and brought back here to practice. We're grasping at remnants of who we were hundreds of years ago. So when I started understanding, I guess, and being introduced in my native spirituality, when I attended my first sweat lodge ceremony, it was as if somebody turned that proverbial light on. Even though it was dark inside the sweat lodge, it was like, for me, the light came on. And I realized that this is who I was. This is what's been missing in my life. And from then on, I've been immersed in my own personal spiritual journey, I guess. And the sad reality is that the majority of our people do not practice that way and do not understand or do not know about the spirituality that we practiced. It's slowly gaining some momentum. I call it a cultural renaissance. Since we started, some of our people went out west and actually earned the rights to bring some of those ceremonies back here and teach and expose our people to traditional spirituality. And I think I could say that I owe those people my life, because if I hadn't known about those ways, if I hadn't discovered some of those ceremonies, that I would say that I wouldn't be here to speak to you today. So as a young Mi'kmaq person growing up, I could say that I was lost because I had no idea who I was as a Mi'kmaq person. And now it's what drives me. It's what keeps me going, is knowing my self-identity and knowing who I am and practicing my own spirituality and my own journey is what motivates me to just get up every morning and live my life and pursue my dreams and work towards eventually going on to the Creator.
I guess I can come now to one of my big question I had for you, especially related to the amazing documentary you've been doing, Sundance, which is about specific ceremony. And could you tell us a bit about, how you've been thinking about this documentary, and I guess what was, the idea about showing and explaining the ceremony? I also understand it's something very interesting in this documentary, and also how we understand the healing ceremonies and how deep it is, in native cultures. So could you tell us a bit about, the specifics of Sundance and how did you get the idea about this documentary?
Yes, well, when I made that documentary, I had only been introduced to the notion of Sundance probably 3 years before that. I was involved at the first ceremony that our Sundance chief actually when he first brought it to our community, and when I witnessed that, and I felt what I felt at that moment, I felt that all our people, all our young people, all our children, all our elders should experience a feeling of watching and witnessing this beautiful ceremony. The problem was when I pitched it to the National Film Board of Canada, of course, they really loved the concept and they supported it. And the issue was that we were trying to film something that you can't film. We were not allowed to film the actual ceremony. So being a film director, it posed a problem. So I had to create a vehicle on how I could bring some of those teachings and some of those reasonings of why it was important on film. So we were guided by the chiefs and basically what we can film, not what we can't film. It was important for us, for me anyway, to respect the protocol. But it was my own personal feelings of believing that people need to see this. They need to know about this, because at that time we were just getting out of a major bout of ills. We had a rash of suicides in our community, and people were basically lost and they didn't know where the answers were. And Chief Nevins brought that Sundance to the people because it provided answers. It provided a way out, I guess, to the turmoil that was happening in their community. So it was very, very important for me. And like they say in the film, like we can't save everybody, but we can save one at a time, sort of thing. So if that film or if the ceremony moves somebody to a point where it changes their lives, then they've done their duty to help one another, sort of thing. So it's really we're still struggling because we're trying to save our nation by trying to understand who we are and where we are, and being embroiled in politics of the day. We're always struggling. We're always battling, because the idea of Canada as a nation, it's a beautiful country. The people here are beautiful, and they're just, I guess, the honor and the notion of being a Canadian it really means something to Canadians. But what they don't understand is that we are Mi'kmaq first. We are who we are first. And the government's always trying to make us into Canadians. And that's where the problem lies, because we're the original people of this land. Our language is of the land. It stems from the land. We stem from the land. If the French lose their language, they can go back to France, learn it, and bring it back. If the Irish lose their language, they can go to Ireland, learn it, bring it back. But if we lose our language, our culture, our prayers, our ceremonies, where do we go? We can't go back anywhere and get back, because this is it, So I think it's important for us to realize that we're at a critical time in our lives, I guess, to try and recover, repair, and retain. That's so important. It's who we are,
And it's very interesting, because I remember when I was in Canada and when I was discussing with other native people, and I've noticed, this conflict sometimes, some had together about how much they want to be Canadian, how much they want to be part of this country, how much they want to be assimilated, how much they want to be, living in their culture on their own territory. So I guess, my next question for you is, how do you understand that? How do you understand this conflict between maybe two kind of different native people about how much they want to look like, the other people in the country, or how much, they want to keep, their culture, their belief, their language, and be kind of aside from what is an ordinary Canadian life, I would say.
There is a constant differences of opinions, I guess. There are some more contemporaries that feel that we need to assimilate and we need to go with the mainstream society, because otherwise we get left behind, and our young people are going to be left behind. There's technology nowadays that we need to catch up and utilize in order for us to achieve some economic well-being within our communities. But at what cost? Like at what cost do you give prosperity? We need to first, I guess, in order for it to work, we need to first have not only self-government on our terms, but also self-determination. We as our people need to determine where it is we want to go as far as our education is concerned, our languages is concerned, our ceremonies are concerned. What is it that we want? So there's self-government, but right now self-government is a term that was derived by the government of Canada, which basically says the Indian Act, the chiefs and councils are going to determine basically or govern their lives. But basically all we're doing is we're only doing the government's job, and it turns out to be like we're administering our own poverty in a way, because they almost like dump it on you and then they're going to blame you for anything that's gone wrong, right? There needs to be a lot of wrongs to be made right in order for us to achieve self-determination and self-sufficiency. If the federal government of Canada was sincere in the truth and reconciliation, that terminology that they use, well, let's go back to when the treaties were signed and what those commitments were. What is the value of the land and the resources that we've lost? And let's make some restitution. If we were paid back some of the money that we are owed based on those agreements, then we wouldn't be where we are. Then we wouldn't need to be living in third world conditions. And we wouldn't need to be dependent on the federal government, because they have a fiduciary responsibility to our people. A lot of people they believe that we are a strain on Canada and the taxpayers' money. But what they don't realize is that a lot of that money is owed to the First Nations people. So in order for us to prosper, in order for us to move on, we need to fix some of those wrongs. And in order for us to have true reconciliation, there needs to be an admission of wrongdoing, And I think that's the only way we can move forward is to try and fix some of those wrongs.
You just mentioned reconciliation with non-native people and giving back to native nations in a way. But I think the main question, and I say this because I've been living 3 years in Canada, and I've been discussing with a lot of non-native people about native issues, and I was often very surprised how unaware they were about native people. They were unable to mention like more than maybe one nation. They didn't really know, the struggle, native people were in. Everything which came back quite often was about the issues related to, drugs and alcohol and like the very bad side, I will say, of the issues for native people. But they don't really know about the history, they don't really know about nations and what they're doing to improve, the situation for them. So how do you feel about that? Like, how do you understand, the reconciliation in a world now where a lot of people are still very unaware of native issues?
Well, it's amazing how little the non-Indigenous community knows about it. It kind of became obvious when a few months ago when the tragedy, I guess, of the bodies that were found in residential schools came to light in mainstream media. First of all, the thing that should concern people is that there should not have to be graveyards around a school, and for them to have graveyards in Indian residential schools is a tragedy in itself. But it all boils down to the mindset of colonial governments. When they first established, the intent was to assimilate. The intent was to annihilate a culture. And it was well within the definition of genocide. Again, going back when they first formed the schools, I don't think they realized that we would still be here in 100 years. So they would have succeeded in what they set out to do. Well, only then, recently, did a lot of people, non-Indigenous people, realize what the Indigenous people went through. It was happening in their backyards, and they didn't see that. I think one of the problems is that when you do acknowledge, when you do hear the truth, when you do see the implications of the historical tragedies that happened to our people, there is a sense of shame, and there is a sense of guilt, I guess, in civilization, because it's the non-Indigenous Canadians that are benefiting from the struggles of the Indigenous people. So in order for Canadians to enjoy the benefits of being Canadian and the beauty of being Canadian, you always have to accept the fact that you played a role in the demise of the original people of this land. So if you always have that denial, then you're always going to have that conflict. Because in order for us to reconcile and to forgive the wrongs of the past, there has to be an admission, right? So we're always going to be at odds. And I think we need to begin working on that, and that the non-Indigenous mainstream society need to know more. They need to make an attempt to understand the history of our people. And how do we fix that? How do we make it where we can all live in harmony together, and accept one another, and really focus on the beauty of our differences in order for us to live side by side and understand one another, I guess. I think that we have a lot of work to do.
It's very interesting because if we speak about non-native people, not only in Canada, but also all around the world, it's crazy to see how little we hear about native issues and how it feels. And I say this, from my point of view as a French guy, because the only vision we have about native people, and especially in America, is in the past. It's always in the past. And for all the rest, the struggle you are about keeping the language alive, your culture alive nowadays, we just don't know. And I guess it's also, on my point of view, I hope, this podcast, can also help to make people aware that native cultures are in danger and that it's important to know more about them. But another question I had for you is, I've been through your Facebook page, when I was trying to contact you in the first place, and I saw something, you wrote, so I'm going to try to pronounce it, clearly, but Mset Nogemag. And I understood from, everything you've been writing about that it was very important for the teachings in the Mik'maq nation. So as we are all here about, understand the Mik'maq culture in general, could you let us know a bit more about what does it mean and what is it so important for the Mik'maq nation, these kind of teachings?
In our culture, when we have ceremony, we most times we summon ancestors that have gone in the past, and we summon them into ceremony. And whether it's a sweat lodge ceremony, whether it's a sunrise ceremony, whether it's a Sundance, whatever ceremony, we summon the ancestors to come and listen to our prayers, listen to our needs, and they have to go back and to the spirit world and take our prayers. But after a ceremony, we use the term Mset Nogemag. Mset Nogemag means all my relations. That means you're acknowledging all of your relations that have passed before you, all of your relations that make you who you are today, because that's what you're carrying. So you're acknowledging them and you're acknowledging what they gave for you to be who you are today. And we can go way back. We can go all the way back to the sun, which would be the original creator, and everything that's happened and everybody who has existed since that time that brought you here to this day. So really, it's a really powerful term because you're really honoring the ancestors when you say that. And then when you say all my relations, your prayers and your intentions are given to them to bring back to the spirit world. And that
you spoke about who you are today, and a question I wanted to ask you, as the audience would have understood how important you would have been in sharing your culture through the music, through documentaries, etc., and something you are doing again now through this podcast. And so, what gives you the strength to do that? How do you manage to do everything you do for your nation and your culture?
You know, I often ask myself the same question because not many people had the privilege to grow up how I grew up. And my father was a lifelong politician, not in a political sense, but he was fighting for our rights, our traditional and inherent and indigenous rights. He always fought for the betterment of our people. He always fought going into meetings with the government to better the lives of our people. And growing up, we sat around the table and he instilled in us the rights that we have as Mi'kmaq people, that how the unfair treatment that we receive from the federal governments on something that they really owe us. He instilled in us about hunting and fishing rights, our right to gather, our right to utilize the land in the way we used to utilize it, and our rights to that. So he basically instilled in us, and we've always lived believing the rights of our people, because he was basically self-taught. He was probably more knowledgeable than a lot of lawyers as far as indigenous rights is concerned, because he dedicated his life to that. And it was almost like following in his footsteps. And it was almost became an obligation for me to share that, not in a official capacity, because I don't hold no title. I'm not. I don't hold the title of chief or any leadership or whatever. I'm just me. But I still feel that I have a responsibility to share and to bring forth that knowledge that I learned from my ancestors to the young people today, in order for them to identify who they are and understand who they are, so that they preserve another generation, so that another generation knows about the history of our people. And eventually, I hope that somebody out there might hear and be, I guess, sensitive to the plight of our people, and that somebody may one day be in a position of power to try and do something about that, and try to fix some of those wrongs that I talked about. And if I can do anything to help further that cause, then I've done my duty, and I've honored my father and my ancestors for what they fought for and what they died fighting. That's what they did.
What would be like your hopes, for the future? Like, how would you like, the future, to be for the Mik'maq nation, but mostly like, for your culture and native culture?
Well, I had a vision about 20 years ago on how, because a lot of people ask, okay, what is it that you want? It's not necessarily what it is we want. It's what is it that we are owed? What is rightfully ours, and how do we fix that? But the answer is almost impossible, because having the political status that we have within the structure of the federal government, and being an arm of the federal government, which is the Department of Indigenous Affairs now, we are within that structure. Our leadership right now is within that structure. Only when we can go back to the status we had when the treaties were signed, will we be able to determine our future. Because right now, if the federal government basically said, okay, we're going to recognize the Mi'kmaq nation as a nation, how can you have two orders of government within one structure? You can't, right? So if it was a perfect world, that's what would happen. But we have to work towards something that's workable and something that we're able to, accept and agree to some certain guidelines and protocol, I guess, on how we're going to honor and recognize the original people of this country. So like I said, we've got a long way to go. It might be pipe dreams, but it's also, if I don't, I guess, express or try to realize the vision, then I'm failing as a Mi'kmaq person.
What would you say then about, for people who would like to learn more about your culture, about your nation, about the struggle, like the Mik'maq nation is living? What would you say, to them? I'm talking about non-native people in Canada, but mostly like non-native people all around the world, and even like, people, listening to this podcast right now.
Well, I would say just keep trying to understand. Try to understand where we come from our worldview of how we see things and where we stand, and not try to minimize that and say, well, why don't you just get on board and let's move forward and as the citizens of Canada, because that's the easy way out.
Yeah.
Because they need to understand who we are. Our ancestors were here. We have at least 10,000 years of blood, sweat, and tears on this land, because this is our land. Our language stems from this land. We can't just walk away from that, because we're doing a disservice to the ancestors. So we have to keep struggling. We have to try to make people understand that we just can't give up. We have to keep fighting. We have to keep struggling for us to be recognized as who we are, as Mi'kmaq people.
Thank you very much, Brian. It was a pleasure and an honor to have you as a guest in Tell Me Your Story.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoy this new and first episode in English. Follow us on Instagram for new updates, and don't hesitate to like or comment this podcast. Thank you very much, and see you soon for a new story.